Episode 9, Salt, a Solid Foundation. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week will be the first of 2 episodes looking at salt. This week will be a bunch of history, checking on some truisms, and looking at how salt made the food world go round. There's just too much good stuff to cram it all into one episode. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. Before I say anything else, when I say salt, I am specifically referring to sodium chloride. If I let chemistry teacher me talk about the other way to think about salt, we'll never get anywhere. So for this podcast, salt equals sodium chloride, because in food, that's what it mostly means. When I sat down to outline this episode, I thought it would be straightforward. I've run across tidbits about salt in everything I've read. So it would just be a matter of sweeping together the bits of historical information into a pile, arranging them attractively on a frame, and blammo! A nifty, informative piece on the history of salt and then 17th century salt. Not so. First, the bad news. As I lifted the metaphorical carpet to look at the floor underneath, it appears the structure I was standing on was... Well, there are some structural myths that need checking out, and the foundation goes deeper than I had thought. But the good news, all that information you've been picking up in this podcast, it ties in with salt, and in ways that were more interesting than I had expected. As with corn, and in many upcoming segments like cows, dairy, and fat, there has been some more careful scholarship of late. People have been going back and checking the aphorisms and assumptions we've been carrying around in our collective cultural back pockets. The archaeology is more thorough. It's more interdisciplinary. Sources from more languages are being added in, like Arabic, Chinese, Sanskrit. And likely the most important, the inclusion of more human perspectives is stripping back the blurring layers of cultural assumptions. Sort of like the head-smacking realization some Egyptologist in the 19th century got, when one of them quit trying to reimagine the housing of ancient Egyptian workers by applying their knowledge of French, German, and English peasant cottages. Somebody actually looked around at the local housing and realized some of the same design and construction techniques were still in use right there in front of them, because they made sense given the climate and building materials at hand. Oh my. Yeah. The truism we've all run across that salary relates to salt because the Roman phrase salarium argentum meant Roman soldiers were paid in salt, or they got money specifically to purchase salt ration. Well, it isn't quite true. Part of the confusion is the tendency to assume argentum is classical Latin for money in general, but it's not. Money in general in Republican and Imperial Rome leaned on a Roman pound of bronze. I knew about the link of argentum and silver from my own chemistry days. The symbol for silver is Ag. But I was willing, like many others, to accept that the argentum in the Latin phrase meant money generally. In my case, due to high school French. In modern French, argent does mean money, and silver. But the important part, salarium means stipend, payment, particularly the regular payment to someone in the military or bureaucracy. There may be a straight line from salary to salt, but that is not it, and so far we don't have access to it, which is a loss for my assumptions. And the more I looked, the more I realized that there were a few other assumptions that were rickety. So I needed to get down to the ground and see what was sound, so I can proceed on solid footing into the 17th century and beyond. So which of my assumptions were correct? Well, first, mammals in general seek salt, and not just people. Certainly, including salt in our diets goes back to before society. There are many a nature paper and documentary showing animals seeking and licking salt rocks, or including the leaves of bushes that accumulate salt in their tissues into their diet. Here is one of the very few places 70s TV nature show science did not lead me astray. R.I.P. Marlin Perkins. Also true. In hot climates where people are more prone to sodium depletion due to sweating, salt gained more societal importance. And before this mechanical age we live in, most people spent most of their day in manual labor. And it's not just sweat. All moisture associated with the human body is salty. Blood, tears, lymph, urine, everything. Thus, the need and want of salt was universal in human commerce. As we get to the first written records, by about 6000 BCE, there are trading accounts showing salt as both a trade and a tribute item. In the 1000s BCE, there is a Chinese medical treatise on the medical benefits of salt generally and on 40 types particularly. From the same time period, there are Egyptian paintings and stone friezes showing salt making. It is handy that certain Egyptian art traditions tend to work like Richard Scarry's series, What Do People Do All Day?, and show essential industries that kept the kingdom working. And salt has long had a role in religion and honor. The offer of salt by a host and its acceptance by a guest place both under obligations of protection, a sort of truce. And once your location in relation to the salt on a table would let everyone know your rank. Examples of the need of multiple fancy salt cellars when co-equal dignitaries were present at a banquet are part of court notes. And it was clear that salt would stop rot. So salt was seen as a way to ward off demons, malevolent spirits, and the evil eye. Later it became a way to reach for eternal life or immortality. Examples such as the desiccation of Egyptian mummies with natron, which is a mixture of sodium chloride and some other salts, and the drinking of elixirs of a variety of chemical salts, along with other such healthful substances as mercury, by European and Arabian alchemists, and more than one Chinese emperor. So clearly, from as long as we get it written records, salt shows up. No arguments there. Another thing everyone gets right, a salt mine was a terrible place to work. This is certainly a job where mechanization has made things better. No longer does the salt miner have to breathe in salt dust in a hot cave and have no place to wash off the accumulated coating that blinds the eyes, desiccates the lungs, and stings at every cut and scratch. The prisoners and slaves that were sent to be salt miners would quite literally dry up and die, dehydrated simultaneously from the inside and out. There's a modern salt mine in Austria that will occasionally turn up a salt-cured Celt from the days before Romans ruled the area. And the preservation is so thorough, archaeologists can determine what dyes were used on the clothing and what the unfortunate miner's last meal was. Salt is such a good preservative that the microscopic sea life entombed within these dehydrated ancient seas can have DNA extracted. Yes, all large salt mines are dried up ancient seas, which means technically all salt is sea salt, which has led some salt companies rather disingenuously labeling mined salt as sea salt. Technically it's true, but it still feels like cheating. So what about that Roman salt money thing? Was that based on anything real? Is there anyone who was using salt as money? Now, salt is barter. That happened all the time. But using a standardized block of salt as a medium of exchange? Yes, this did go on. Marco Polo reported salt bricks stamped with the ruler's image. There are substantiated reports, up into the 20th century, of small salt bricks being used as a recognized money around the Red Sea. These small bricks were cut from saline ponds in the Afar Depression, which is an area down at the southwest side of the inlet from the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Sea. They're the hottest year-round average temperatures on Earth, and frequent droughts make those salt ponds particularly productive, if a rather hellish place to live or work. And the generally arid quality of the surrounding area means salt money isn't going to get melted as long as you are generally sensible about it. But no. There was no practice of paying Roman soldiers in salt or giving them money to buy salt. That whole thing turned out to be sloppy translation work by some know-it-all 19th century British scholars getting out ahead of their skis. Though the Roman treasury official in charge of salt taxes and prices was known as the salinator. The other claim I kept running up against, that salt was revered and seen as valuable as gold, this was a smushing together of some correct ideas into a new misleading synthesis. These are always the hardest misapprehensions to correct, but I'll give it a try. Yes, everyone values salt. It is essential for long-term health and general well-being, and the salt trade is very valuable. But chunks of salt itself were not greatly revered or lusted after. No individual chunk of salt was ever valuable. There was never a fashion for, say, salt jewelry or salt statues. But rather it is the trade in salt, or the ability to source it or manufacture salt, that is the thing worth fighting over. Salt is a volume business, and the product is shelf-stable. No merchant ever risks a warehouse of rotten salt. Melted salt, maybe, but never rotten. The real money was in the taxes and tariffs on salt, supplying it to the armies or industries, holding the contracts to control and sell it at a set price. The real money was in the taxes and tariffs on salt, supplying it to the armies or industries, holding the contracts to control and sell it at set prices, because it is a required material. This was and is how salt makes you rich. Sort of like, I guess, information storage is today. Right now, we can purchase insanely large storage devices for incredibly cheap prices, which means this SD card or that storage drive isn't particularly valuable all on its own. But running a secure data archive is valuable, controlling access to information storage. The monthly contracts are where the money is. So back to salt. If you take something like apples or cotton or paper, each of those have alternatives and can be sourced many places. People could stop buying them or find ways around official channels. This makes such general items like these harder to tax at the rates needed to build a new palace or set up silver statues or fund a war. But everyone needs salt, and the sources are somewhat limited. It can be bottlenecked. In France, for example, there was the gabelle, a particularly reviled French tax on salt that was in place from the 13th century to 1790. It was started to fund the crusade of Louis IX, who would later become Saint Louis. But it eventually went on to build palaces and fund wars. In fact, the control of salt production has been used to shift nations. Just two well-known examples are the infant city-state of Rome, crossing the Tiber to kick out a rival tribe and establish its first colony at Ostia in the 5th century BCE, for the purpose of controlling the salt marshes for salt production. And Gandhi starting the Indian independence movement by gathering salt from the ocean, he knew what he was about, even if at the time the British didn't. So salt is important. Everybody likes and needs it. But when did salt start to play a part in food preservation? There's no great consensus right now, largely because food is so ephemeral. But if you go with something along the lines of, it was going on before the last major ice age around 12,000 years ago, you probably won't start any fistfights on archaeology Twitter. We tend to think of water being the thing that Neolithic settlements required when choosing a location, but access to salt also appears to have been an important factor. As long as societies were mainly nomadic, everyone can move about to local abundance. The importance of preserved food is limited, partly because when everyone was always on the move between food sources, there was a limited need and ability to store food. But once a society puts down stakes, or more likely bricks, to claim a permanent home site, preserving food becomes essential. No longer can everyone follow the food as it becomes plentiful through the seasons. Now there is a need and an ability to store up extra food at home for the lean times. And if it is possible to preserve out on the trail, a bounty can be transported back home. Because agriculture and stationary societies are linked, things like cereal, grains, and figs are a big part of early food storage, but not all. There was also a need to preserve meat and fish. Dried meat certainly lasts longer than not dried meat, but salted dried meat lasts much longer. And over time, salted plant foods were also developed. And salt wasn't just used for food preservation. It was used in small industries like pottery, hide tanning, and later metallurgy that made stationary societies possible and prosperous. Along with anchoring societies, salt has also helped cultures develop their cuisines. In order to develop a cuisine, one needs to have a variety of ingredients available at the same time. Without preservation, you can't develop regional flavors beyond the plants, animals, and spices that are just there. But with preservation, flavors can be developed. The sausages, sauces, cheeses, and pickles of a region applied to the game, livestock, vegetables, and grains create regional flavors. Think about how much of what we identify as a regional flavor depends on its sauces, and think about how many of those sauces are salty. Ketchup, Worcestershire, soy sauces, fermented bean sauces and pastes and miso, fish sauces, oyster sauces, mushroom sauces, horseradish sauce, garlic sauces, hot pepper sauces, Vegemite. The list goes on. As I've been looking at the ancient history of foods and where big societies have been located, all the ones that have left impressive ruins had access to either salt deposits or good conditions for getting salt out of the sea. The Himalayas are even now famous for their slabs of pink salt. The pink is due to inclusion of iron ions. The earliest trading caravans across the Sahara brought not spice, but salt, from mines in present-day Mali to salt-poor regions of Central Africa. Incidentally, this salt trade to the Sahel would be part of the forces that gave rise to the Songhai Empire I mentioned in episode 3. The Andes, cradle of some of the monumental corn-based civilizations, also contain large salt deposits. Evidence of salt manufacturing by a combination of solar and fire methods around 2000 BCE, plus or minus, is not only found around the classical Mediterranean world, but also in China and in multiple coastal locations along the Indian Ocean, in South and Central America, and in tropical Africa. This salt landscape, salt mines and solar and fire salt extraction, is just about where things are in the 15th century, when Prince Henry of Portugal, our old friend the navigator, is getting his project going. A big reason for the Portuguese investment in sea travel was until then, the main way people traveled far, between continents, was over land. This was slow and expensive. A train of 500 camels had less capacity than one of the early Prince Henry trading ships, the caravels. And a round trip from Western Europe to India could easily take 2 years. And you'd need to feed all the animals in the pack train, camels, mules, donkeys, whatever. And every day on the road leaves you open to tolls, taxes, bribes, marauders, and negotiations with each animal driver as your bags of spices and bolts of silk bounced along through Central Asia, or what came to be known as the Silk Road. After the first few tries, those caravels could do the same trip in half that time, carrying more at a far lower cost. And over time, the ships would get bigger, the routes would become more regular, and the time would drop even more. Once the Portuguese and Spanish had nailed down that you could get around Africa to India and back and forth from the Americas semi-dependably, well-traveled trade routes between Europe and Africa, Europe and India, Europe and North and South America quickly developed. And along with those transatlantic routes and the ships going around Africa, there was also a whole set of Spanish traders sailing between the west coast of North America to the Philippines and China. These were known as the Acapulco ships. And we can't forget that the home of domesticated corn was just inland from Acapulco. This route developed due to the enormous silver mine in Potosi, Bolivia. It was Peru then. There was this whole mountain that was pretty much made entirely of silver. Well, a bunch of the silver was coming back to Europe on those Spanish galleons and causing the Spanish to start wars with everybody else in Europe, which I mentioned in episode 5. These Acapulco ships were taking between a quarter to a half of that silver from the giant mine in Potosi to the Philippines, where the Chinese had set up a trading city so the Spanish could buy silk and porcelain. The exact amount is hard to know because smuggling was so rampant. But it was enough that for at least 100 years, starting at the end of the 16th century, a majority of the silver being used in imperial China was from the Spanish viceroyalty of Peru. Incidentally, this is also when sweet potatoes, corn, and chilies got to China. So like I said, China had corn before the Pilgrims did. This whole tangent is to say, there was a lot of money in this global shipping thing. By the middle of the 16th century, ships were setting off in every direction for months at sea. And as always, with a rise of technology, there was also a predictable rise of war and piracy using the new technology. European port cities expanded to cater to this growing trade, war, and piracy by ship. A big part of the expansion was providing salted rations, mainly salted beef or beef stand-ins, as I've talked about before, pork and fish. As a result, the need for salt grew to the point where salt production shifted from meeting local needs to functionally an industrial scale. Supplying the shipping industry was so lucrative that areas best suited or situated for salt production were expanded. The overall result was more salt and cheaper salt, and with more salt available, small-scale local salt production nearly ceased. Governments were particularly fond of this change because centralized salt production meant it was easier to tax the salt or set up restrictive monopolies. Again, the money isn't in salt itself, it is in the control of salt. Which brings us right about up to where we need to be for next week. 17th century salt. I'll take you through the British Atlantic colonial relationship with salt, including how it was made and where you, a 21st century person, can easily taste 17th century salt. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with any promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for this episode. If Twitter is not your thing and you have questions or quibbles, I am reachable at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. That's all one word with no spaces. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show's description.